The night Delia Voss Harrington found the second phone, she was looking for a pen. It was sitting in the drawer of the kitchen island. The one Elliot always said was too cluttered. The one she'd been meaning to organize for 3 years. She'd pulled it open looking for a ballpoint to sign the forms from St. Andrew's Foundation, and there it was, a prepaid, the kind you buy at a gas station. Tucked beneath a rubber band, a crumpled receipt, and a bottle of Advil. She didn't open it right away. She stood in the kitchen of their Westmount home, the one with the cathedral ceilings and the original hardwood she'd fought to restore, and she held the phone in her palm like it was a stone she'd found at the bottom of a river, still, waiting. Then she put it back, signed the forms, and made dinner. That was the kind of woman Delia Voss Harrington, 37 years old, director of the Harrington Voss Community Trust, had become. Calm on the surface, watching everything. Elliot Harrington, 42 years old, chief operating officer of Meridian Capital Group, had not always been the kind of man who kept secrets in kitchen drawers. Or at least, Delia had not always known him to be. When they met in Ottawa, he'd been junior counsel at a small investment firm. Too earnest, her mother had said, too much of a talker. But Delia had liked that about him. He filled rooms with his voice. She'd spent most of her life learning to make herself smaller in rooms, and Elliot took up exactly the space she'd left. They'd married at 29. She'd followed him to Montreal when Meridian promoted him. She'd set aside her position at the Federal Heritage Office. Temporarily, she'd told herself to run the trust. The trust that her grandfather, Leonard Voss, had established. The one that quietly funded indigenous language programs, rural medical clinics, and 3 coastal conservation projects that most people in their social circle had never heard of. She had not told Elliot about the other part of the trust. That was the thing about keeping your own secrets. It made you careful about other people's. The second time she found something, it wasn't an accident. She'd been watching the way Elliot moved through their shared life. The slight delay before he laughed at her jokes, the way he angled his phone away at dinner, the evenings he stayed at the office until 8:30 when she knew for a fact that the Meridian building on Peel Street cleared out by 6. She was not paranoid. She was a woman who had spent 15 years reading grant applications for funding. She knew how to identify what didn't add up. On a Tuesday in March, when Elliot said he had a quarterly review dinner with the partners, Delia drove to the restaurant herself. She sat in her car across the street, engine off, heat on. She watched him walk in with a woman she'd seen once at a Meridian fundraiser. Dark-haired, sharp-shouldered, expensive coat. The woman's name was Renee Bascom. Delia had looked her up. Senior portfolio advisor, Meridian's newest acquisition from a firm in Toronto, 31 years old. They sat at a corner table. Elliot pulled out Renee's chair. Delia drove home and made tea and sat at the kitchen table until midnight. She did not cry, she thought. What Delia thought about, mostly, was her grandfather. Leonard Voss had built what people in the industry quietly called the ghost holding. He'd spent 40 years creating a private investment structure so deliberately unassuming, nested trusts, numbered companies, a portfolio manager who communicated only by encrypted courier until the 90s, that by the time Leonard died, the structure was worth considerably more than anyone outside of 2 law firms and 1 accounting office in Halifax knew. The public face was the community trust. The private face was something else entirely. Leonard had called her into his study in Antigonish, the summer she turned 22. He'd handed her a sealed envelope and said, "You don't open this until I'm gone, and you're ready. And you'll know when you're ready, because something will have made you angry enough to stop being polite about it." She'd opened the envelope at 34, when the Trust's board had tried to vote her out and hand operational control to Elliot's colleague, a man who'd never read a single program report, simply because Elliot had suggested it would be cleaner. She'd read the letter alone, in the back office of the Halifax law firm, for 2 hours. She had not told Elliot what she'd found. By April, Delia had a plan, not revenge. She was careful about that word, careful about the feeling people confused with it. What she had was a question that needed answering, and she'd learned that the best way to answer a question was to follow the money. She requested access to the Meridian Capital Group's recent filings, publicly available, nothing dramatic, and began reading. She had a background in heritage documentation, in archival research, in the painstaking assembly of fragmented records into coherent narrative. She approached the financial records the same way. It took her 3 weeks to find the first discrepancy. A vendor payment, consulting fees, and $40,000 to a numbered company she didn't recognize. Cross-referenced against the Trust's own donor records, Meridian was a corporate donor. She found that the payment had been approved by Elliot in his COO capacity and signed off during a quarter in which Meridian had publicly announced a hiring freeze. She found a second payment, then a third, all routed through the same numbered company. all in Elliot's approval chain. She sent a quiet email to Gordon Ashwell, the independent auditor the trust had retained for years, a man in his 60s who'd known her grandfather. She didn't tell him what she suspected. She only asked if he'd look at something for her, as a favor. Gordon called her back in 4 days. His voice was careful. "Delia," he said. "Where did you get these?" she said. "You need to talk to a lawyer." "I already have," she said, which was also true in a different sense. What Elliot did not know, what he had perhaps always failed to understand about Delia, was that she had never actually stepped away from her career. She had redirected it. The trust was not a consolation prize. The trust was the instrument through which the Voss family had maintained quiet, sustained, and entirely private influence over a significant portion of Atlantic Canada's development funding for 40 years. And Delia, as the sole named beneficiary and operational director of the trust structure that sat above it all, was not an administrator. She was the owner. The Voss Institutional Holdings. The name appeared in no press release, no magazine profile, no industry directory, held controlling interests in 4 mid-market companies, 2 of which operated as silent investors in real estate development along the St. Lawrence. One of those development corridors had been partially financed by Meridian Capital Group in 2019, which meant that Meridian, and therefore Elliot, had been operating for 6 years in a space that Delia quietly owned a piece of. She had not known this was relevant until she started looking. Now she knew it was very relevant indeed. The confrontation when it came was not at a dinner table. Delia wasn't interested in theatrical moments. She arranged a meeting. She asked Elliot to come to the trust's boardroom at Sherbrooke Street on a Wednesday morning, telling him only that there was a matter related to Meridian's donor relationship that required his attention. He came in loosening his coat, already performing ease. Gordon Ashwell was there. So was Céline Tran, Delia's lawyer, a woman in her late 50s who had never once raised her voice in a meeting and had never needed to. Elliot's expression shifted when he saw them. "What is this?" he said. "This is a conversation," Delia said. She placed 3 documents on the table: the vendor payment record, a summary of the numbered company's registration, which traced through 2 intermediary layers to a holding registered in René Bascom's brother's name, and a 3rd document, a letter from Céline outlining the trust's legal position with respect to donor relationships where conflicts of interest had not been disclosed. Elliot looked at the documents for a long moment, then he looked at Delia. "I can explain the payments," he said. "I know you can," she said. Gordon has questions about whether the explanation holds. The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges furniture in a person's mind. "Delia," Elliot said. His voice had gone careful. "Quiet. Whatever you're thinking, this isn't what it looks like, Elliot." Celine's voice was entirely neutral. "You've been provided documentation of 4 vendor payments, totaling approximately $1.3 million, routed through a company with undisclosed connections to a Meridian employee with whom you have a personal relationship. The trust has a duty to investigate any donor activity that presents a conflict of interest. This meeting is that investigation." He sat back. "I want my lawyer," he said. "Of course," Céline said. "We'll schedule a follow-up." That was it. The meeting was 12 minutes long. Delia stood, gathered her folder, and walked to the window while Céline escorted Elliot to the door. Below St. Catherine Street was grey and wet, the sidewalks full of people in heavy coats moving through the usual morning. She felt for the first time in months, entirely still. The weeks that followed were not simple. Delia had not expected them to be. Elliot called her 6 times the night of the meeting. She let the calls go. He sent emails, first controlled, then not. He came to the house on a Friday evening and stood in the front hall, saying the things that men say when they've been caught and have run out of other options, that she'd misunderstood, that she was making it bigger than it was, that he'd made mistakes, and he was sorry. But did she understand what she was doing to their life? She listened. She had always been a good listener. Then she told him that Céline would be in touch about the separation agreement. The look on his face, the specific look of a man realizing that the woman he'd underestimated had in fact been paying very close attention for a very long time. She did not take pleasure in it, but she did not look away from it either. She owed him that honesty at least, that she saw him clearly. He left. She locked the door. What came out in the audit was more than she had expected, though perhaps less than she'd feared. The vendor payments were connected to a consulting structure that Elliot and René had set up to divert contract fees from a project that should have been arm's length. The amounts were significant. The legal exposure was real. Meridian's board opened their own investigation when Gordon's preliminary report made its way. Through the appropriate channels, Céline was very clear about appropriate channels, to the right offices. Elliot was placed on administrative leave in May. René's position was quietly restructured. Delia did not watch the news about it very closely. She had other things to attend to. What most people would have found surprising, what Elliot himself had clearly never considered, was that the trust's legal position in this situation was considerably more complex and considerably more powerful than anything connected to a marital dispute or a donor investigation. The Voss institutional holdings, once Celine had spent 2 months carefully mapping the structure with the Halifax firm, turned out to have a passive interest in Meridian Capital Group itself. Not a controlling interest, a quiet one. Purchased through an intermediary in 2012 at the direction of Leonard Voss, who had believed, in his old-fashioned and entirely correct way, that it was sensible to own a small piece of the things that affected you. When this fact was disclosed, as it was required to be, during the course of Meridian's internal investigation, the board of Meridian Capital Group had a very interesting week. Delia received 3 phone calls from board members she had met exactly twice at fundraising dinners who had previously addressed her Elliot's wife. She returned all 3 calls. She was very polite. She was very clear. In June, Delia sat across from Meridian's board chair, a man named Franklin Osei, in a meeting she had requested herself. He was in his 60s, sharp, recently returned from a year's leave following a health issue. He had not been part of whatever Elliot and Renee had built. She had done enough research to believe that. "Mrs. Voss-Harrington," he said, "I think we need to discuss the holdings position." "Yes," she said, "we do. Are you considering an active role?" She looked at him. "No, I'm not interested in a board seat or operational involvement. The holdings position is passive and I intend to keep it that way. What I'm interested in is whether Meridian's internal governance structure can ensure this kind of arrangement." She placed one hand on the folder in front of her. "Does not happen again." Franklin Osei looked at her for a moment. "That's not the conversation I expected," he said. "I know," she said, "but it's the one that matters." They talked for 2 hours. When she left, she walked 4 blocks to a café on de Maisonneuve and ordered coffee and a croissant and sat by the window, watching the street, and thought about her grandfather, who had spent 40 years building something quiet and durable, and had given it to her because he believed she understood what it was for. It was not for accumulating, it was not for winning, it was for outlasting. The separation agreement took 5 months to finalize. It was not easy. Elliot hired an aggressive family lawyer who spent the first 3 weeks making claims about the marital home and the commingling of assets that Celine addressed, with a thoroughness that Delia came to find almost meditative. There were difficult phone calls. There was a week in August when she sat in the kitchen at 2 in the morning and thought about all the ordinary Tuesday mornings she'd made coffee and read the news and thought she was living a life she understood. She'd grieved that, not the man, not anymore, but the years, the particular texture of a life she'd believed in. But grief was not the same as regret. She was careful about that distinction. By September, the trust had launched a new funding stream, rural mental health supports in 3 provinces, something she'd been drafting for 2 years. She presented the initiative herself at the foundation's annual gathering, in a room she'd chosen deliberately. The old railway hotel in Halifax, where her grandfather had held his first board meeting in 1978. There were 40 people in the room. Most of them had worked with the trust for years. 2 of them had known Leonard. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes. She talked about what the trust was for. Not the language in the charter, but the actual thing, the conviction underneath it, that the people who are easiest to overlook are often carrying the most, that the institutions meant to serve them frequently fail, not out of malice, but out of inattention, that the role of the trust was sustained attention, showing up the same way, year after year, for things that did not make headlines. Afterward, a woman in her 80s named Margaret Cove, who had been one of her grandfather's first grant recipients in 1981, a school in Pictou County that had used the funding to start a breakfast program that had since fed 30 years of children, came up to her and took her hands and said, "He would have been so proud of you, and also, I think, a little afraid of you." Delia laughed. It surprised her how real the sound was. Elliot sent one last message in October, not through lawyers, a personal email, short. He said that he hoped she was well, that he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that he understood, now that he'd underestimated her, and he was sorry, not for getting caught, he said, but for not seeing her, for deciding, without asking, that she'd made herself small. She read it twice. Then she closed the email and went back to the briefing she'd been preparing for a grant review. She did not respond. Not out of anger, there was simply nothing she needed from that conversation that she hadn't already given herself. The legal proceedings against Elliot and Renee wound through the fall and into winter. Delia was not a complainant in the criminal matter that had been initiated by Meridian's board through the appropriate channels. She was a witness, briefly. She gave her statement to the investigators with the same precision she brought to everything, and then she went home and made dinner and watched the news and fed the cat she'd adopted in August, a large grey animal named Provisional, whom she had named that, because at first she wasn't sure she had time for him, and then she'd realized she did. In December, Meridian's restructured board sent a formal communication acknowledging the Voss Holdings' passive interest and outlining revised governance protocols. It was a dense document, 42 pages. Delia read every page. She made 3 notes in the margin, sent them to Celine, and filed the document in the appropriate place. There is a thing that happens sometimes when you have spent years believing that the architecture of your life was built together with another person, and you discover that you were, in fact, the primary architect all along, that the foundation was yours, that the materials were yours, that what looked like a shared construction was, on closer examination, something you had been quietly holding up. There is grief in that. There is also, if you are honest, something that is not quite relief, but is adjacent to it. The recognition that you are not smaller than you thought, that you were always enough, that the silence you'd learned in rooms full of louder voices had not diminished you, it had sharpened you, in the particular way that stillness sharpens things. Delia Voss Harrington did not leave Montreal. The house on Westmount was sold, too large, too full of the specific silence of a marriage after it has ended, and she moved to a flat in Outremont, high-ceilinged, with good light in the afternoons and enough shelf space. Finally, for all the books she'd been keeping in boxes since 2011, she kept running the trust. She kept working. In February, she received a letter from a 14-year-old in Digby, Nova Scotia, who had received a trust-funded laptop through the Rural Education Initiative and written to say thank you, 3 pages, handwritten, about what it had meant to be able to do her schoolwork at home and not have to stay late at the library in the dark. Delia framed the letter and hung it in her office next to her grandfather's photograph. That was the point. It had always been the point. She had simply been the only one, in the end, who'd remembered to keep it.